my big idea for this particular session. And for me, I'm a big believer in what I talk about sometimes with my teams called cadence and investment. And I like to use metaphors because metaphors are certainly ways to help us gain access to things that maybe we don't know and we want to learn. And saying something is like something else, using similes, metaphors, et cetera, are great ways to do that. One that I use quite often is the example, and I'll stand, I'll sit. Used to be, I almost said stand in front of people during my trainings, and I'll ask them a very simple question on Zoom. I'll say, raise your hand if you want to be fit and healthy. And the interesting thing about that is most people do. And then my next question is, okay, raise your hand if you went to the gym today, because that's certainly one way that we get fit and healthy. So eating right as well, but going to the gym is a big part. Exercise is a big part of getting healthy. And when I ask them that question, a lot of hands go down. And so I say to them, I say, look, if we're going to be effective in fitness, what helps is to set up what I refer to as cadence and investment. Cadence is about when we do something. So for instance, if I'm going to the gym, I should go to the gym maybe 5 out of 7 days, maybe Monday through Friday. And during those times I go to the gym, right, I have a cadence. I should have a certain time that I go. That makes it a cadence because it becomes easier. Maybe I'm one of those people who wakes up earlier then, and I go to the gym early. Me, I like to actually run. It's hard to tell from looking at me, but I do. And when I do that, I schedule that in the middle of the day, because that's the point where I might start to be slowing down. I need a little extra energy. So my cadence is to do that generally in between noon and 1. But once you have that cadence, the next thing you need to ask yourself the question is, okay, I'm going to do this, but how long am I going to do it? How much am I going to invest in this? What investment is necessary in terms of time? And certainly what we do for exercise in this case will determine sometimes that investment of time. But I don't think it happens by default. If you think about our world today, we have so many distractions, so many things that can take our time, and our time is really our most precious resource, folks. It's the only thing we can't make more of. Whatever time limit you have on your life, it's going to happen regardless of what you want. So time is a precious commodity. So time is an investment. So how much do I invest? Well, I take that same type of approach with some of my Scrum teams when I work with them. I'm not saying I force them to do it. I don't force anybody to do anything. I don't force anybody to do Scrum. But if they choose to do Scrum, I like to talk to them about cadence, and I like to talk to them about investment. And interestingly enough, for those who do Scrum, and one of the reasons that you do Scrum as a way to achieve agility is because it is written in the Scrum guide. So I'm thinking a lot of you are familiar with your Scrum folks, your Agile folks, who are familiar with the Scrum guide. In the Scrum guide, there are suggested time frames. If you haven't paid any attention, it's the last sentence. I mean, the Scrum guide gets smaller and smaller, but the suggested amount of investment is still in there. Now, I don't know what's going to happen when they update it for the next update. Maybe they'll get rid of it, but it's been there for a while. So I want to review the ceremonies and or events of Scrum, and I want to talk about what does the Scrum guide say about the time that we should be involved with it. Now, the interesting thing about the Scrum guide is the Scrum guide uses 1 month as the time frame. They're assuming 1 month sprints. And 1 month sprints is not something that most folks do these days. In fact, shorter sprints are probably better. The almost default amount of time that people spend in sprints these days is 2 weeks. So I'm gonna translate what they have to say into 2 weeks. Obviously, you're smart enough. You probably do better math than I do. You could translate it into a week if you choose to do it. If you're doing 3 weeks, come talk to me. That's an anti-pattern. A lot of teams do 3 weeks because they do 2 weeks of development and then 1 week of QA. That's not what you should be doing. So if you're doing 3 weeks, chances are it's probably anti-pattern. Come talk to me about that. But I want to look briefly about the various events and ceremonies, and you all know them. There's only a few. That's the beauty of Scrum. One of the things that's good about Scrum, and it's good because you don't have a whole bunch of things. It's lightweight. But the daily Scrum is suggested as up to 15 minutes per day. We all know that. So if I do the math, 15 minutes per day for a 2-week sprint is 2.5 hours. So just to do the daily Scrum over a 2-week period, I have to invest 2.5 hours. Sprint planning is the first thing that we do. What are we going to do in this next sprint? It's the very first event. And they recommend up to 8 hours for a 1-month sprint. Now, if you're doing a 2-week sprint, that means it's up to 4 hours. That's quite a bit of time, actually, and it's not what I recommend. But I want you to pay attention to what they have to say about it. We should be investing quite a bit of time into our sprint planning. Probably most of us aren't. The sprint review is up to 4 hours for a 1-month sprint. So I'm going to say up to 2 hours for a 2-week sprint. The sprint retrospective is this kind of odd thing. It's 3 hours. It's up to 3 hours. It doesn't have to be 3 hours, up to 3 hours. And that translates into 1.5 hours. And then what else do we have? We have this stuff called refinement. It's one of the places where teams really, I don't have a whole lot of time to go into it, but they really don't do a good job. And they certainly don't invest the time that's necessary to be successful if they're doing Scrum. One time somebody asked Sutherland Swaber, it's on the 10th anniversary, I believe, of Scrum itself. They said, how much should be invested in refinement? And they said 5 to 10%. So I can do math, not very well, but I think I can do this one. For a 2-week sprint, that means 4 to 8 hours. So I want you to look at just the suggested, and again, it's up to, but if you look at the up to suggestions of this, what do you have? You have quite a bit of time. You have 14 to 18 hours, up to 14 to 18 hours per sprint. Now, I want to ask you all a question. This is rhetorical because this isn't Zoom. We can't really be too interactive, though you can put some comments in the comment section if you wish. How many teams do you know invest 14 to 18 hours in the Scrum events and ceremony? The answer is probably 0. I've worked with hundreds of teams in my practice. I've never found a team that invested up to 14, 18 hours. So the question is, how much should they invest? And this is a question you should talk about with your team, especially when you're creating team working agreements and you're just starting out. What should you invest? I'm going to propose that 14 to 18 hours is too much. I propose with teams 10 hours. 10 hours is a starting point, right? I'm going to save you a little bit of time from what they do. You're probably going to do more than you used to do and you think you should do, et cetera, et cetera. Can we agree on 10 hours? Let's assume they do, because I'm going to run out of time here. What might it look like? Well, if I have 10 hours that I'm going to invest and I have 10 days in my sprint, Larry's feeble mind, and this is something I came up with many, many years ago, and I've actually done it. So this is not just theoretical. Larry's feeble mind says 10 divided by 10 is 1. What if we do 1 hour a day? What would it look like? So I came up with this. This is 1 contiguous hour per day for 10 days. And you can see that I've mapped onto this 15 minutes for the daily Scrum, which would happen first, and then 45 minutes of what I refer to sometimes as team time. And what it might look like and what are the events and ceremonies we might do during team time. Now, this is idealized, it's stylized. And there's been very few teams that I've worked with that said, yeah, we're going to start out, we're going to do this, because you can always change it at the retrospective, but you got to have somewhere you start. So this is a good start. So we usually talk about this and say, okay, how does this look to you? If you agreed to 10 hours, here's 10 hours, here's what it might look like. Do we need to move things around? Do we need to change things? And we'll come up with a schedule that looks similar to this, but not exactly this, usually. But it's something that we can ensure that we are going to have the cadence and investment that's necessary for us to be successful.